the Mellotron for me is just like God's gift to musical instruments, as far as I'm concerned. But I've always loved it since I knew what one was. What's that weird sound on those great records? And then, with the help of a bit of money from a record deal, got hold of an M400 off a band that Dean produced, Adn2X, who'd split up and selling some of the gear off. So I got their M400 at a very nice price with 3 tape frames, some 99 sounds. Took them to Streatley, and they got rid of all the tapes. They said, "Oh, they're all knackered, these, you know, replace them all." So I had a free blank canvas for sounds. So obviously I wanted the violins and the Mark II flutes and the choirs, the 8 choir and the Mark II brass. And then I was sort of thinking what other sounds could I wish I had the cellos on it as well. I wish I'd put that on. And then they serviced it and repainted it, got it back, and
it was black, right?
It was black, yeah. So
it used to belong to Palace, did it?
Yeah, it used to belong to Palace. I think it's actually a rebadged Novotron, but it actually says it's Mellotron. It's a Mellotron plate, and it stood in the attic. I went and picked it up from Streatley after it had been serviced. Looked beautiful, sounded beautiful, and paid them, and then got it back in this 4x4. Me and this friend who got the truck, got it back to our house, and my studio's in the attic, and it's got a little windy staircase up into the attic, and we just couldn't shift it. It was halfway up this curved staircase. It was like the PG Tips advert, you know. And I had to actually phone my dad up, who luckily was at home, say, "Can you come and help us?" So we're stuck, you know. So we had to wait about 10-15 minutes for him to drive down, and then he came and helped us. And then with 6 hands, it was like he'd have to take the banister off the stair thing, and managed to get it around the corner, plonk it where it's remained ever since for the last sort of 8 years or so. It's not moved.
You plugged it in?
Yeah. I don't know.
I think everybody knows that Bill brought the Mellotron to this country. He brought 2 over from the States, and he was looking for someone to make the heads. My father and his 2 brothers, Les, Frank and Norman, were working for the father and building tape recorders, that kind of thing. So obviously they were around in the media as people that built heads, Bradmatic Limited. And shortly after the father's death, which was early 62 now, they had a phone call from this American. And he said, "I'm after 72 matched replay heads." And they ummed and erred and said, "Well, yes, of course we can do that. What's it for?" And he wouldn't actually tell them. Frank, the tallest and the most logical, said, "I think it must be something to do with music or something." Oh, clever. Subsequently, they were invited down to London and went into this hotel where Mr. Bill Fransen was staying, and he had this thing in the room, this huge kind of double keyboard, big humming thing. And he demonstrated it to them, and they were absolutely knocked out. There's, of course, nothing like it. And subsequently, of course, we then look at the manufacture of the whole thing. After a long search for finance, with a lot of dead ends, eventually the Eric Robinson organisation steps in. We've got money coming in. So now we're into production. So they take the Chamberlin apart and they look at it, and they needed a more reliable mechanism. They strip it down, they start to look at the mechanics, improvements, a proper chassis, a strong cabinet, this kind of thing. And as it went on, Les, who of course was very technical, began to realise that Bill was making silly errors about the mechanism, and he didn't fully understand to do with sizes and measurements and stuff like that, but he was good with the torque. And of course he had arrived in this country with a patent in his name, and Mr. James Harvey Munro between them. And Les started to think, I'm not sure about this. Now, he was very friendly with Bill. Bill was a very friendly person. You know, he was a good guy. He was larger than life. He was, 20 stone. He was a big, tall, 6'2" kind of guy that he didn't argue with. But Les and he hit it off and got on really well. So I think Les sort of ignored the fact for a while. It was only when Harry found out about the Mellotron subsequently that, of course, the shit hit the fan. And technically, of course, he did steal those Chamberlins. He brought them to England without Harry's permission. Same thing. But if he hadn't have done, this machine here and all the subsequent ones would not exist. After the little deal with Harry, and obviously they paid out a settlement, Bill continued with Mellotronics, and he actually became the Midlands sales agent. And he was an enterprising man. And I think it was probably towards the end of '65 that he eventually disappeared. The production continued, of course, and the refinements, and the Mark II was a much better animal. It had got proper chains on the Reynolds chain on the cycling, and quieter audio paths, different wiring, improvements. It looked the same on the outside. Taken up by a lot of beat groups at the time, of course, and subsequently people like the Moody Blues and the Beatles and others. And they decided Mellotronics wanted a smaller model, really. So we went for the M300, which is a 52-note keyboard straight through. And it had rhythms and it had leads in the same way. It was still aimed at the home entertainment market, but it was a bit smaller, a bit lighter and a bit cheaper. Meanwhile, of course, bands were still using them on stage. Now, the original machine, and the M300 for that matter, weren't really designed for stage use. So slowly the idea formulated that we should just have a single keyboard lead instrument. And they developed the M400. The prototype was built in 1970. And of course, initially they were still pushing the M300 and the sound effect console, because this was quite a versatile instrument at the time, because obviously the sampling and things like that didn't exist. And so they were still building these probably up till 1970. After that point, of course, the emphasis then goes on to the M400. Once it gets on a few recordings and people realise it's there, of course, they were selling like hotcakes. So sort of 71 into 72 and 73, they just could not make them fast enough. And so they expanded the factory, they moved into the place next door, and then the place next door to that to store the machines when they were finished. And so really it was quite a big success story that it was taking off. Subsequently, of course, technology raced ahead and it became old hat, but for some time it was selling really well. Then of course we get a sort of slow demise. You've got synthesizers being able to stay in tune and funny things like that. And of course, it was not the death knell of the Mellotron, but technology is overtaking it. But of course, as we all know, things tend to go around in circles. So it sort of faded. I went to work at the factory in 1976, and I worked there for 10 years. Finally closed on February the 13th, 1986. And of course, I thought, that's it. I've done that. I had my own machine, and that was it. So that's Mellotron's over. Of course, a bit short-sighted. We start to get interest. I met Martin Smith, of course, because he had bought a machine that had a few issues, and Les himself came up and met Martin. He was a bit bored with his job and he wanted a Mellotron, so he bought one via my father, Les, who put him in touch with the Moody Blues. He bought one, brought it home, didn't quite work properly, so John is summoned with his spanners and screwdriver. We do a few tweaks and Martin says, would you like to go for a beer? Okay then. And so we go down and have a couple of beers and we talk about things, and slowly an interest develops, and then we think, well, maybe we can do something about this, because there are still Mellotrons out there, and slowly we get into it, do a few little jobs, and it starts to take off, and eventually we're both doing it full time, which I never would have thought would have happened again, but there you are. And we're doing quite a lot of service work, renovations, and we have quite a bit of demand for machines and we can't get enough. So I thought, well, what about if you actually build a new one? So we looked at the way it worked, what we could do to improve it. So we put an improved keyboard action to make it lighter, faster to play, reinstigated the cycling system, so you have 8 stations, so in one machine you've got 24 sounds. So we're now building the M4000. We came up with a prototype, got it working properly, happy with it. 2014 right now, we've built 36 to date, and we've got enough orders to keep us going for another 2 years at least. So things are okay.
When I was at university, I had an experimental band, which was quite early in those days. I mean, and we sort of banged around on different things which you could bang around with, and played instruments in a funny way, and so I suppose that gave me an interest in it. I don't think we actually did any recording. I think tape recorders were very expensive in those days. And then I became an exploration geologist, and then when I got married, that was incompatible. You know, my last job was going to be in the Falkland Islands dependencies. That's in Antarctica, and that's not good if you're going to have babies. And so I don't know. Then I suddenly thought that it was a very good time. There were lots and lots of ex-army shops in central London, ex-army and RAF naval shops, with a huge amount of junky gear which could make sounds and could be filters and oscillators and analyzers and things. It was terrific. I'd always wanted to have sequencers rather than cutting up tape. And then David Cockerell had made me quite a lot of voltage controlled devices. And then one day he said, it's no use, you've just got to have a computer to control all these. And then it was obvious a computer could give out lots of signals and sequences. I could say, all right, first of all, this voltage, then that voltage, and gradually that expanded into having a whole studio which was controlled by the computer. He was sort of a miraculous engineer. I was pretty good at thinking things up, impossible things up. This is what I'd like. And David never blinked an eye about the possibility of making it. He would make whatever was thrown at him. And he had a marvellous career after EMS too. He went to IACAM in France and worked for Hyde and all sorts of very good things. But without him, EMS wouldn't have started at all. It just couldn't. It required somebody of his inspiration and incredible sort of cleverness at design and plugging your way into it was perfect. Yeah, the best in electronic music engineer that's ever been. Tristram Cary was our third partner, and he was very involved in the design of the first VCS3 wooden box. And yeah, he was, as far as EMS is concerned, he was right in at the beginning of EMS. But that wasn't the beginning of my studio. He was well known as electronic music film producer and serious composer. And so he came to visit me. And then at some point I thought it would be a good idea to form a company, EMS. And so that's when I asked David and Tristram to be partners in it. And he'd become a friend by then, but at the beginning he wasn't involved at all. And then he gave it up because he didn't like the involvement in the end either. He was a serious composer. He had his own setup in Norfolk. My setup was only I could use it. In fact, last week there was a meeting in London, the Computer Arts Society, which had a meeting to discuss a meeting which I had with the Arts Council and the Gulbenkian Foundation in 1971, where all the sort of musicians and people in experimental music all came together, and I'd offered to give my studio, providing there could be a national studio. And Gulbenkian, who had lots of money, were interested. And so the Arts Council was there and everybody was there and said, this is brilliant, all right, we've got all this equipment and it's a good basis. Now we just want a foundation to house it, to finance it. And then the Arts Council got up and said, electronic music is completely useless. The Arts Council is not going to have anything to do with it, nor any government body. It's a DAO. It's got nobody's interested, and it's got no artistic value whatsoever, and that was the end of it. So after that, instead of wanting to have a national studio, I decided to continue myself, and thought of making instruments to sell in order to finance the studio. So that was the way of funding it. The first was a VCS3, and then that was followed by a keyboard, a DK, I can't remember what it was called, DK2 in the end. So it must have been a DK1. And then there was Synthi A, and then a keyboard attachment to it, the KS sequencer. So the digital sequencing came a bit later, and then there was a whole plethora of instruments, pitch to voltage converters, guitar instruments, random number generators, and then finally the huge Synthi 100. And then after that actually there was a computer-controlled Synthi 100, so it was a computer Synthi, and then the vocoder. And the vocoder was in the end incorporated in this gigantic machine, which had a vocoder, computer, and the Synthi 100. That was the biggest thing we made. Once we were delivering one of these in Paris, Robin Wood and I, who we were talking about, and on the way back we were so pleased to have all this cash in our pocket. We went to a cafe, and then after 60 miles or something, we realised I'd left it all behind. We drove back and there was this man in the cafe counting it out. It was an enormous amount of money. It was like, I don't know, it must have been £8,000 in cash, which now is a gigantic amount. that was a good one. Then our American agent who was selling them took it up and tried to make us a public company in America, and that was the downfall. It got too big, we borrowed too much money from a bank. There was a crash in America and the bank wanted back all the money we'd borrowed, and that was the end. We just couldn't cope. Whereas when it was a smallish British company selling to schools and that here, it was brilliant. I mean, it worked fine, and it didn't matter if there weren't any sales 1 month or something. It was fine, it was all. But once it got to this big thing in America, and in those days it was, people were talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds, so we'd borrow £100,000, and we had $200,000 dug check from a bank in America, and it turned out to be a fraud, and the bank had accepted it here. But when you talk about £100,000 now, it mightn't be all that much in terms of a house, but then we're talking now, it's £1 million, £1.5 million, it's a lot of money. And so we got too big for our boots, really. I think that was it. And it also, I wasn't interested in the business, I hated it. I wanted to just get on for music, and so that was, that's why it folded. Well, the National Theatre took it on, and then they put it in the basement, and it got flooded, because they didn't do anything with it. They just got, last time I saw it was covered with exercise bikes and things like that, all piled on top of the computers. And then we sold off a few of the tape recorders, the Ampexes and things like that. The company then was bought by somebody, Williams, and then Robin Wood bought it from him, and all the bits then ended up with Robin Wood, which is great.
What I think about the synth is it's otherworldly. It's the most important thing about it is the sound, and the way it's set up. You don't approach it in the sense that it's a keyboard or anything like that. The joystick was a great attraction. It seemed to be very novel, and I remember seeing the Pink Floyd live at I think it was Walthamstow College or somewhere, and I remember them seeing fiddling about with a joystick, and I thought it just seemed so peculiar. When you got the synthy, it was just it was like a secret world, like all these people. God knows, I thought there was just this bunch of scientists somewhere that came up with this thing. It may as well come from like sort of Stingray or something like that. Some magic machine that had just suddenly been sort of ditched on Earth. And the difference with that and say the Moog, for example, is when we bought the Moog, you'd get a load of patches in it that would say things like violin or cello or trombone, and so mostly because of the patches, you sort of went towards making traditional instruments, or you'd start off with that patch, but they sounded so good that you weren't inclined to go too far away. Whereas with the synth, it was almost the opposite. You went from nowhere to this thing making a noise somehow that was pretty difficult, until you figured out the funny patch bay and stuff. It was pretty difficult to know actually how the noise was being generated. The first album, we used it on quite a bit. It's pretty much all the sort of bass synth would have been that. I can remember the sequence on that song Western Promise, the sequence at the beginning. Probably all the bass parts were probably that. I think Slow Motion, I've got no idea that was done. The bass part I think was done on the EMS. But it's that, out of all the synths I've ever had, that's my favourite synth. I wouldn't want to use it live though.
It makes a good sound, doesn't it? It sounds pretty good. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that you've seen, I saw in the brochures of the EMS brochures, or in books about synthesizers. There were these. I think I saw a picture of the studio in Putney, and there was like some guy with a beard, kind of, and an A4, a clipboard, scratching his head and trying to work out. And I thought, this is great. It's one of those things that is kind of from another planet that you never imagine that you'll ever own. And I never did imagine that I would ever own one. And it just, even if it didn't make a sound, it's such a beautiful object anyway. It's just an incredibly good-looking thing. But in the sort of early to mid-80s, I got hold of this AKS here, and so got into the world of EMS, of how it works, the pin matrix and everything, and the lack of stability and very hard to pitch, but I didn't really mind it. Those things, people who own those still use them on a daily basis because they're great for processing as well as for creating sounds. So I was very into the world of EMS, of that sound world. And then, again, it was around that time that I mentioned before, when we were talking about the Moog module, when everything had to be digital, everything had to be MIDI. People were throwing stuff away, pretty much. And I got a tip-off that the University of East Anglia, who had a famous kind of electronic music department, had one of these, were selling it or getting rid of it because they were installing computers and digital stuff. And this is big and heavy and awkward to handle. So they said basically, through this contact, he said, look, I can get it for 500 quid but we have to take it away, So I said, yeah, let's do that. I didn't know what kind of condition it was in. And he borrowed his dad's van and went to pick it up. And he said, this is really heavy. We've got to get, when I come back down to you. So I got a bunch of people from the office, mute, to come in and help carry it. What we soon realised is we were never going to get this up the stairs. It was too heavy and too big. And the guy who drove the van had borrowed it from his dad, and his dad needed it the next day. So we were stuck with this, driving around London with this Synthi 100 in the back of a van, trying to find somewhere to leave it overnight. We ended up leaving it at Conk, actually. We used to work at Conk Studios, owned by Ray Davis, and there's an engineer, he's not there anymore, a guy called George Holt, who is also a synth nut, and he says, please leave it here, So we left it there, and eventually we managed to get it into the building. But it's incredible. It works. This one, it mostly works. It's very, I can't get the sequences to work, but everything else is a bit, some of it's a bit crackly, but it all works, and it's not, if you know how to use one of these, that's just a much bigger version, so it looks like a bit daunting, but actually it's not that daunting. But you do go cross-eyed trying to figure out, because the pin matrices are big, so you're putting a pin in an oscillator, now you want to get that into the filter, and it's going on, but, and you get some great sounds. Again, I haven't used it on many big projects, I've used it, mostly I've used it on remixes, where I've got a sound and sampled it and put it in, which sounds a bit of a sell-out, cop-out, but still. But it's just, I just like looking at it, really. It's beautiful.
Well, I suppose I had this very big gap of sort of like 35 years until 2010, it might be, to about 4 or 5 years ago, when I got commissioned to write a piece of music. So up to then I hadn't done any electronic music at all. I had a computer, but I didn't do any music. And I had to really start composing. And so in the last 4 years now I've got lots of commissions and done quite a lot of music. In fact, I'm doing it all the time. And it fits very well. It's just so much nicer having what have I got in this machine? 20 or 30 terabytes of storage. You know, I mean, what? And my first computer was 4K. So, and the first hard drive was 32K. That's, you know, so sometimes at night when I can't sleep, I try and divide 4,000 into 32 terabytes. And it's many, many millions.
Obviously, WASP, Electronic Dream Plant, started by Adrian Wagner, Chris Huggett, and that was back in 1977. Adrian couldn't be here today, so he's asked me to come along and talk on his behalf. But I've been talking to him for 35 years. But what I haven't talked to him about is some of the stuff that happened before I joined EDP. So I thought this is a great opportunity to ask him. So I've been speaking to him recently. And most people who hear or know anything about Adrian will know that he's related to Richard Wagner. And you might think, well, I'm sure that's not quite true, but it is true. He's the great-great-grandson of Richard Wagner. So Adrian was studying music. This was years before EDP started. He was studying music at the Royal Academy. And it was at that time he came across his first synthesizer, and it was the EMS VCS3. And when he left the Royal Academy, he went and worked at the Riverside Studios. But at the same time, he was also tinkering around doing a bit of service work. And so he tells me that he was doing some service work for Moog. I don't think this is the official service department, but he was helping Bob Moog do some servicing. Then it was during the time that he was working on his second album. He'd made one album already for Charisma, and he was working on his second album, which was called Lost Inca. And he was using a 3M 16-track tape recorder, and it went wrong. There was some fault with it. And so he phones up 3M to say, our 16-track recorder is broken. Can you send an engineer around? Guess who the engineer was? It was Chris Huggett. So Chris turns up, and in the process of repairing this, Adrian's chatting to Chris about his idea for a low-cost synthesizer that's based around a digital oscillator. And they spoke for several hours about this, and Chris showed real interest in wanting to be involved with this, and that's how the first idea came about for this product. And apparently over the next 3 or 4 weeks, the two of them met up. Adrian tells me they were drinking Bloody Marys every time they got together, and they came up with this product. Chris had gone away and made the first designs for what was going to become the WASP synthesizer. I always thought, what a brilliant idea to call a product a WASP, and what a brilliant idea to make it, black and yellow. So, but I'd never ever asked Adrian what gave him this idea. So when I spoke to him last week, I said, Adrian, brilliant idea. Why did you call it the Wasp? And he said, because he hated wasps. I said, well, that can't be the reason, surely. He said, yeah, no, I hate wasps. He said, actually, it was called the Hornet before the Wasp. But then he realised, although he hates hornets, he hates wasps even more. And actually, if I'm absolutely honest with you, he's got a big thing about all insects. And I think, he's paranoid about anything that moves. So that was the first thing. The second thing is I said to him, obviously it was called Wasp, so that's why you came up with the colours. He said, no. He said he didn't want anything that was black and white. This is the reason why I went for black and yellow. He had to have black because the plastic was vac formed, so that had to be black. And the white didn't look quite right, so that's why everything went yellow. So my whole thing about this being the thought of, the inspiration of a genius is actually a lot more simple than that. He didn't like wasps, and he didn't like the colours black and white. But between the two of them, they came up with this brilliant idea of a digital oscillator-based synthesizer. At that time, as we know, everything was analog. And from memory, I think the cheapest Moog, a mini Moog, was about £500 or £600 from memory. So the second most important thing about this was that it was sub £200, and everyone assumes that it's 199, but it wasn't actually. It was 198. Adrian reminded me there's actually £198 for this, which for some reason he thought was really important to be 198. And then the filter, because it's the filter on it that really gives it its kick.
The sound of it is really all about the filter, I think, which you can crank the resonance up and it just screams. It's a beautiful, and it's just, there's nothing else, again, it's unique. Nothing else will do it. And if you just do that classic wiggling the filter thing with the resonance right up into a delay, if you're working to a film, everything just looks epic straight away. It's just a very big, lovely noise. And then, of course, it will play itself. It's got that kind of primitive LFO sort of trigger thing. And you can just set up these weird little self-perpetuating sequences with it, which sound insane. You just don't believe that this tiny little bunch of a very small number of knobs can make such a huge variety of sounds. And of course, you're lulled into a full sense of security because it's got a little speaker in it. And when you make sounds out of that, you just think, oh yeah, great. But what? Plug it into your hi-fi and bang, it's huge sound.
Then the next thing is, how do you get to £198? Well, what you do is you get rid of all the moving parts, the keyboard. And also, by getting rid of the keyboard, then maybe you're making it more accessible to people that don't actually play the keyboard but want to play a synthesizer. So Adrian came up with this idea. He wanted something like the stylophone, if you remember the stylophone with the pen and everything. But he wanted the stylophone without the pen. So this was the next challenge that he gave to Chris. So Chris went off, and the genius that he is came back with a capacitor-based, touch-sensitive keypad. And that's what we know about the Wasp. And of course, what that did is it meant that people who couldn't play keyboards could still play it, still zip up and down, and it made lots of funny noises anyway. But then real musicians could actually use it as well.
My first synth was a Korg 700S, which I bought second-hand from Macari's in Shaftesbury Avenue, not knowing really what I was buying, but knowing it was a synth, and it had anyway, whatever, it sounded great. I've still got it. But that was pretty much the cheapest synth you could get at that time. Shortly after that, the Wasp came, and a lot of people I know, people in their late teens, early 20s, I knew who were interested in electronics, got the Wasp. And it sounded fantastic. It had almost like a weird, maybe it was because it was like so light, it was very lightweight and kind of hollow plastic. It felt like it almost had an acoustic sound. I know it sounds odd, but it's the filter or something. It's a really special sound. And I used to play live with a guy, sadly no longer with us, a guy called Robert Rental, who made a single roughly the same time as I did in the late 70s, and we got to know each other, and we were offered a gig individually, and neither of us wanted to do it, so we got together, and he used a Wasp. And he also had a throbbing gristle. Chris Carter made a gristleizer for him, which is like a kind of an effects thing which he used with the Wasp. And the problem with the Wasp was the touch-sensitive keyboard. As soon as the venue got slightly sweaty, it would just go off and decide to play whatever it wanted. It actually sounded pretty prog. I think maybe they programmed prog into it so that when all these punks were just going, it started to play all this prog stuff as soon as it got sweaty. But, I mean, great sounding synths, really great. And Robert Rental and his another guy who made a single called Thomas Lear, they did a great album called The Bridge on Industrial Records, which is all done on the Wasp. And if anybody's interested, that's, you can tell how great it sounds from, it's a really good album.
When you see something that doesn't have a keyboard on it and you're a keyboard player, you think, well, this is not really, this is a toy. And actually, this was Adrian's biggest concern. Even though he had a great product, his biggest concern at that time was people wouldn't take it seriously. And also, he was saying that Jeff Wayne had been working on a synthesizer called the Thunder Child. I'd never heard of this. So this was also in the back of Adrian's mind, that somebody that he knew had worked on a similar project, and the thing never saw the light of day. Adrian was living, I think, in Goring at that time, and he needed to find somewhere to base this new company because after 2 or 3 months working on the project, they realised they've got to start the company. So they started the company. And Adrian found Red Gables in Stonesfield, just north of Woodstock, just outside of Woodstock. It's actually in the grounds of Blenheim Palace. And you could look out through the window, honestly, and see pheasants walking around outside. Pheasants, and a few peasants as well. And even though we were so far out of London, we found that people would travel out to London. When we were later on, in the next year or so, when people would come out to do business, they loved coming out there because it was coming out to the country. It was beautiful, beautiful place, and there's nice places to go out and eat. So within a few months after that, I think about 6 or 7 months down the line, they produced the first 100 Wasps. Adrian picked up the phone and spoke to a mate of his, Rod Argent, and Rod Argent agreed to distribute the Wasp throughout the UK. He bought the first 100 pieces. Adrian delivered the first 100 and actually went for the opening day, which was on a Saturday. And when Adrian got there, because of all the hype, there was a queue round the block. So Adrian, he couldn't get into the shop. There was a queue of people waiting to buy this. And that was the first day. By the second day, or the second working day, Rod Argent phoned Adrian and said, we've sold the 100, we need the next 100. I haven't yet started the distribution yet because we've sold them all. So this was now 1979. I was working in a piano and organ showroom in Maidenhead. In comes this guy with red hair and a ginger beard, who later on I found out was called John Hall. So John Hall comes in, bringing this box under his arm, and speaks to the owner. The owner says, Fred, the synthesizer, it's your job. And he opened the box up and out came the Wasp. And I thought, what the heck is this? We plugged it in and I thought, wow, this is fantastic. And so I got speaking to John Hall and I said, what do you do? He said, well, actually, I'm not the sales guy. I'm one of the engineers. And we've decided that we need to try and sell a few. So I said, who's the owner? He said, well, Adrian Varda. I said, okay, well, thanks a lot. He went away and I went home that night and I wrote a letter. I said, dear Adrian, fantastic product. I'm the guy that you're looking for. Not knowing that he actually was looking for a sales guy. That's how I got the job. And the next product we developed was the Spider. And the Spider was actually invented by Stephen Evans. Stephen Evans was someone that Adrian had found. He worked at Oxford University Computer Department. So Adrian had this idea. He's got the Wasp, but he wants a sequencer to go with it, a digital sequencer. Then Adrian had the idea that he wanted a small version of the Wasp. At that time, a guy called Tony Griffin had written in. He was in the final stages of his university degree thesis on industrial design. and he wrote to Adrian saying, could he come in and do a project on electronic dream plant? So Adrian brought him in and said, not only can you do a project, why don't you work on this new idea I've got about a smaller version of the Wasp? In fact, why don't you have a go at designing it? And over the course of the next year, we came out with the Gnat, which was successful. We came out with this Caterpillar, which was a dummy keyboard, which was amazing because you plug in 4 Wasps to it, or you plug in 4 Gnats to it, and you'd get a 4-note polyphonic synthesizer with the punch of 4 Wasps. Unbelievable. It was just a fantastic product. And then that led on to the Wasp Deluxe here, which we put a wooden cabinet round and keyboard, and he had at its peak there were 2 production lines going, 2 shifts, 16 people. This was taken, I think, in about 1981. There's a very youthful version of me at the back. I'm at the back on the left there with the Caterpillar, which was the keyboard that came out, a dummy keyboard. Next to me is Chris Huggett, and he's holding a Gnat. Next to him is Stephen Evans, who is holding the Spider sequencer. Front row, 2 directors of the company, Kathy Hamilton and Queenie Hamilton. Queenie's holding Wasp Deluxe, and next to her is Tessa, who's holding a Wasp. Anyway, so as the year went by, so we went through 79, we went through 80, and we had some ups and downs, and I have a really happy memory of a promotional tour. Adrian came up with this great idea, said, Fred, let's go out on the road. What we'll do is we'll get a double-decker bus and we'll stack it full of wasps and gnats and all the insects that we had, and we'll go on a tour. And we did. We went to the key retailers that were selling the Wasp, and the tour was called the Catch Us If You Can tour, which I thought was quite good. I think I might have had something to do with the title. It always struck me as a bit funny. Catch us if you can. Please come and see us. But we had a few creditors at that time as well. We did owe a bit of money. So I always thought that there was this subliminal message. We're out on the road. You can't get us in the office. We're out there. Try and catch us if you can. We'll pay that bill one day. It was a bit like that. One of the final places we went to, we had this idea of we need to go somewhere where there are people with money. Eton. So we took this double deck. Now, if you've ever been to Eton High Street, it's not the widest high street, and I think this is the only time a double-decker bus has actually been up it. Well, we went one direction, but we couldn't get back again. We had to reverse this, and all this traffic everywhere was held up, and this is me and Adrian standing outside this bus in Eton High Street trying to think, how are we going to get out of this? And I'm even wearing a Wasp t-shirt, you can see that. So we had a number of investors in the company that came and went, and as we went into when was it, 1981, things did get a bit tough, and I think things got tough with lots of people in the industry. Electronic Dream Plant eventually became Wasp Limited, and as I say, unfortunately, came out with a couple of products, but the company came to an end, and sadly, in 1982, I had to leave, but I'd had 3 years there. And years later, whenever I was in a music shop or talking to someone about synthesizers, and I'd kind of mention, oh yeah, I was with Wasp, the reaction from people, even now, it's just amazing. Oh, the Wasp synthesizer, what a fantastic... It's the first synthesizer I ever used, and the reason I used it is because I didn't have a keyboard then, I could play it. And I know a lot of people that started that way, and a lot of people have said, what has Adrian done since then? Well, for me, fortunately, I've stayed a friend with him for 35 years. He's, if you don't mind me saying so, he's one of the most influential people that I've met influential people in my time. But there's just something about Adrian that marks him out. He's a genius. He's a very brilliant guy. He has wacky ideas, which a lot of them are great. Some of them are wacky, and it was a real honour actually working at that time. I didn't realise how important it was going to be. But years later, when I look at it, and the reason we're talking today is to hear about that. And I'm sure Chris Huggett has got many different, has got a different perspective on what happened, you know, and all of that. So actually, I thought I'd ask Adrian, what do you think is the legacy from all of that time, the legacy of WASP? And he said, well, he says he feels very proud that he introduced, you know, one of the world's, or if not the world's first digital synthesizer. He feels proud that he managed to get it out at that cost price. And actually, he's really proud that it wasn't seen as a toy, and that it actually did establish itself with musicians, and that it sits in that sort of place. So the thing is, if you look at if you go online and look at Adrian's biog, it will say composer, artist, producer, and inventor. But what I'd like to put on there is that, you know, not only is he that, he's a really kind, generous guy, and a good mate, and I'm really pleased that I know him. And that's it. That's Adrian for you.
I was in a band called the Unsquare Men, and we used to have to they play the top 10 every week. That's what we did, and everybody came to see us because we played the top 10. And all the tracks have got strings on them. Roy Orbison's got violins on it, and without that, it doesn't work, does it? It's not. Well, I got this clavioline thing, little thing you put by the side of the piano. And it sounded a bit like a stylophone. But I found that if I played it through a Watkins Echo box, then the single tone coming from the clavioline, with a bit of vibrato on it, was delayed a little bit, and it built up on itself. So it's like multi-tracking it 3 times. And that made the vibrato go out of phase, which gives you a sort of sound like a lot of violins playing together. It's called a chorus effect. Actually, I didn't know that at the time. I just thought it sounded a bit like the strings we hear on the records. And most of the time, they're played single notes anyway, and they're long. So I just played the clavioline along with it, and it livened it all up, gave it a sort of new, authentic feel to it. And I thought, I played that like that, single notes for a while, and then by accident I found that if I arpeggiated my fingers like that, then with the echo on, it almost together into a chord. So you got that, okay? And then I started playing the things like Exodus, theme from Exodus, with one hand and this thing behind it. And it sounded really huge. I mean, it was marvellous. So that's the basic concept of what I wanted to do. But after that, I saw it's a bit slow and you can't do everything you want to do. It'd be nice if you just did it on a keyboard. So the idea was then to have one note with playing 3 tones, all with a random vibrato on them, so that you get the chorus effect for each note. That's how I thought the idea up. Okay, you could see what the driving force was to copy the sounds that were on the records at the time. So whilst this was going, to get it into context, I started learning the piano when I was 7, and I had hay fever, real bad hay fever, so I couldn't go out playing football and chatting the girls up and everything. I had to stay in and find something to do. One of the things was playing the piano. The other things was teaching myself electronics out of Practical Electronics magazine. There's a great building blocks series in there, and it taught me all about transistors. So I got to know about, I learned how to do soldering and all that stuff. And And I thought, well, I'll try and build one myself. So where do I start? You know, do I go and buy the bits? And I could buy the bits, but it was really difficult. In the end, I actually went to an organ manufacturer, a church organ manufacturer, and I bought an oscillator board. I couldn't believe where I got it. I mean, in those days we were using Veroboard, which is plastic Bakelite stuff with copper strips on it with holes in it, and you cut them out. It's quite a sophisticated way of doing it. This thing was just a piece of Bakelite, real Bakelite, with holes drilled in it, and the components were stuck through the holes and twisted at the back to make the circuit. So there's no solder at all. And this is like thousands of pounds worth of stuff. These big organs. This is, you know, they charge a fortune for it. Anyway, they sent me this thing, this board, which made a horrible noise. It was basically a single oscillator and a divided down octave. And I wrote it all down, drew the circuit diagram out, and then copied it again onto Veroboard, and then worked out how you make a low frequency oscillator to modulate the tone with it. And I put it all together. At the time, I'd left the band by the time I got that all together. And I went to Jack Jackson's son's studios in Rickmansworth. And while I was there, I was building this thing up, getting it together. And I actually put it all together so that it worked. And it doesn't exist anymore. This was raided for the next one, but they had screws sticking out the top of it for the 12 notes of the octave like that. So you could turn them in and out to tune it. There's little coils in it. I went and did a session with it, and I got a grand sum of £60. That was morning and afternoon with this thing. And what a roast that was, because I've never done a session before. You put all this music in front of me, and I was it was chords and stuff like that, and I didn't read music that well. But it went down a storm. They all loved it because it has saved them a fortune. They usually use 8 violinists, and 8 violinists all day came to something like 500 quid. Okay, and they got me for 60, and almost the same sound. So from then, I just went and did sessions everywhere, and that's really sort of got the ball going. And I used to play it like this. You get a nice thick sound. With a bit less of that. Spread out chords, like the way the orchestra does it. So people find that very difficult. It was mostly played up there, and always double tracked. After that, we got interest from the organ showroom in Harrow, North Harrow, and they provided the means for me to make another prototype of it, which is then what we exhibited everywhere, and got a lot of interest in that. And that was the same. It had 3 oscillators in it. It sounded good actually, and the deal with them was that I said, if it all goes pear-shaped, I want the prototype to keep. And it went up to Ling Dynamic Systems in Cambridge and made a prototype up there, which we exhibited at Frankfurt and various different other places as well. And there was this guy who was very interested in it, and he kept asking questions and things, and he got really interested. So we got a bit worried that they were going to pinch it. So we took all the boards out when we left it there at night, and put a little hair across the thing, so, like James Bond. And sure enough, we came the next day and the hair was missing. And somebody lifted the lid up to look inside, and when they saw there was nothing inside, they didn't know what to do. You did have to put it back every morning to do there for about 3 days. And that was Selena. He heard the sound, and he tried to, they thought of a different way of doing it. It's the same idea, but it wasn't as good. And I got a patent on the way we did it, but this was the sort of phased way of doing it, which I'd never heard of. And it got pinched, really. It's a shame about that. And that's about it. That's the end of the story. I carried on doing sessions with the prototype for ages after that. And that got me into writing. I got the satisfaction of making it in the first place, which was wonderful because I was so well known, taking the thing around all the studios in town. I met all sorts of interesting people in the music business, very important ones. And it got me into writing jingles, and it got me onto the War of the Worlds with Jeff Wayne, and then it got me writing my own stuff after that, up for the BBC. So you can't say I didn't make anything out of it. I did because of the effect it had. I wouldn't have been able to get into session work without it, because I'm not that good a musician. I can't read music very well. But I was there because I was useful, because I was making a lot of money for them. I didn't have to pay them violins. No, I didn't make any money out of the actual manufacturing.
So this thing started off all being about he wanted to make something that was more in tune than a Moog. That's got nothing to do with what, to me, to my joy and to what's incredible and the complexity of this. It's just, I think that's amazing. Such a tiny little thing. And the journey starts then, when you just make that one step. Good things come out of a good heart that's obsessed.
For British people of kind of our generations, who were born in the 60s and 70s, I think you kind of brought up with electronic sounds, like the radiophonic workshop.
Doctor Who and
when you used to go to school and they'd stick on these big educational videos and stuff, and it'd always be this weird electronic music in the background.
Maths now, sort of thing.
But yeah, if you're into sort of sci-fi and stuff like that, and it kind of all fits together. It all fits together. It fits together with Jerry Anderson. This kind of, I don't know. It's in your psyche, isn't it?
The mission of the Bob Moog Foundation is to ignite people's creativity through the intersection of music, science, history, and innovation. It is a mirror reflection of Bob Moog's legacy, his work, his passion, his dedication, and we translate that into two main projects. The first is Dr. Bob's Sound School, which is our hallmark educational initiative, where we teach second graders right now the science of sound through the magic of music. Eventually we hope to increase that to other grade levels, but for now we're teaching 7 and 8 year olds all about how sound is generated and how it's heard, how it travels, And we have had a great success with that program. It's a huge personal joy for me to see the manifestation of our work come alive in a young person. The other project where Bob's spirit and work is definitely alive is in the preservation of the Bob Moog Foundation archives, which is an extensive documentation through schematics and prototypes and all kinds of notes and paraphernalia, memorabilia, vintage catalogs, and on, that essentially trace the evolution not only of the Moog synthesizer but also that of electronic music history. And we're very dedicated to preserving that collection and sharing it with people to the most extent that we possibly can through our website and through exhibits and hopefully upcoming traveling exhibits. It is a tremendous honor for both me and everyone on the staff of the Bob Moog Foundation to be carrying Bob Moog's legacy on through this wonderful vehicle where we can continue to inspire people of all walks of life.